just sorting things out at my end. Welcome to the Community of Policy Professionals third webinar for 2020. And before I introduce the topic and our speaker, just a little housekeeping. Please turn your video off because we can see you in your homes and wherever you are. And it's a little distracting, although it's nice to see you are real people. We'll be turning over to our guest, Shane Fitzsimmons, in a moment. So just in case you missed that, please turn your mute on and your video off. We will try and do our best at this end to ensure that the things are as quiet as possible. Now, I'd like to open by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today across New South Wales, and showing my respect to elders past, present and emerging, as well as extending a warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that we may have joining us today. I'd also like to welcome our distinguished guest, Shane Fitzsimmons, who is Commissioner of Resilience New South Wales. Shane was appointed as the inaugural Commissioner for Resilience New South Wales and Deputy Secretary Emergency Management with the Department of Premier and Cabinet from the 1st of May 2020. And this followed a distinguished career with the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. He was Assistant Commissioner and held responsibilities for operations, strategic development and regional management. And he was also appointed in as the Commissioner of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service from 2007 to 2020. He has held many roles and participated as across both New South Wales in terms of chairing the New South Wales Rural Fire Service Bushfire Coordinating Committee and Advisory Council. Is also a member of the New South Wales State Emergency Management Committee. And was also a board member, has also been a board member of the New South Wales Government Telecommunications Authority, a director of the National Aerial Firefighting Centre, and a director of the Bushfire Corps from 2009 and to 2014. He was also appointed as a councillor of the Royal Humane Society of New South Wales in 2016. So I'm now going to turn over to Shane. What we are intending is that Shane will talk a little bit about his experience in the interface between policy operations, and particularly in the context of bushfire emergencies. And we will then, after hearing a bit of introduction from him, hopefully that will go for 20 minutes or so, and then we will turn over to a question and answer style format. So if you have a question, you might like to put it into the chat function on WebEx, and I'll facilitate the questions to Shane. So with that, we'll get underway, and I'll just pass over to Shane now.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to chat this afternoon. As indicated, just a bit of an overview about the season and the policy context, and of course, more constructively, discussions and questions post that summary. So from the outset, can I say that in the Rural Fire Service or the emergency management sector, the overriding priority in all that is done is around life safety. So the first driving principle in all that we're doing is the preservation of life. Then comes the preservation and protection of property, and then closely behind that is the protection of the environment. So there is already a statutory framework for which we have a priority policy framework around what our priorities are and what our drivers are. Underpinning that, if I say from the outset that particularly in a volunteer organisation and a highly decentralised organisation like the Rural Fire Service, an organisation made up of 72,000 volunteers in over 2,000 brigades, geographically dispersed right around the state, administered through 50-odd local management centres through to a regional and state structure. The criticality behind policy is ensuring that it's relevant. And the old adage we used a lot was policy is only as good as its applicability or relevance or take-up when locally applied. So our investment in trying to secure policy frameworks that resonated and that were relevant to the applied sense was really, really important. I think the other thing that's important as we reflect on this last season is that as we came into the season, it was shaping up in an outlook sense to be very similar to the season before. As a matter of fact, some of the depictions about the above normal areas for expectation in 1920 had contracted compared to 18-19, the season before. What was driving the above normal potential was very much the prolonged and profound effect that the drought was having on the landscape of New South Wales and what that meant in terms of an absence of moisture in the landscape, an absence of moisture in vegetation. And in the lead up to the last fire season, we were working with other arms of government, local communities, local councils, in dealing with some pretty significant policy matters around a lack of water supply to a number of rural and regional locations around the state. So there was an investment in working and partnering with options and solutions to look at supply and storage of water for firefighting purposes, but then also introducing new policies, new guidelines to reinforce firefighting techniques as we went into the last fire season that would limit the use of water or sparingly use water. And if we did start accessing water, particularly from farmers' dams and what have you, having the arrangements in place, clear and upfront, socialised and understood about what the replenishment or replacement arrangements might be for water that was consumed in the firefighting effort. There was an adjustment to the investment in looking at heavy plant and machinery in a very proactive sense to support the firefighting effort. And even as we were coming into the drought, the careful and considered use of fire, and particularly with the loss of livestock and livestock destruction, there were new policy implementations taken to provide a much more responsive and streamlined approach to the destruction of carcasses, for example, to allow the use of fire in a more timely fashion rather than the normal regulatory arrangements of 24 hours and those sorts of things. So policy has really got to be under a parental framework, but having the ability to be dynamic and responsive to the changing, unfolding circumstances, the likes of which we experienced during the last season. And as we went into the last season, even though the forecast identified a fairly large geographic area as being the potential for above normal, no one expected it to be as unprecedented as it was ultimately playing out over many, many months. And the season turned out to be unprecedented in a number of ways. Number one, we had one of the most drawn out and protracted periods of uninterrupted dry weather, relentless weather that drove fire behaviour, that drove fire danger conditions, and that drove fire spread, resulting in extraordinary damage, destruction and devastation across a very broad geographic area of the state. We were averaging, people forget, we were averaging more than 1,000 fires a month in New South Wales in the months of winter, which are typically our cold and wet periods. So during June, July, August, they were getting over 1,000 fires a month, and then that just intensified and increased as we went into the spring and summer periods, culminating in some of the worst of conditions and widespread damage that we saw through October, November, December and January. So the other unprecedented aspect was not only the drivers around weather and climate and fire behaviour, we saw also widespread damage on a scale that we've never seen before in New South Wales. Just under 2,500 homes destroyed, and tragically 26 lives were lost, including 6 firefighters that lost their lives. We had 3 aircrew in one of our contract aeroplanes, the large air tanker that was out here operating in New South Wales when it crashed down near Cooma in the south coast. Captain Ian Macbeth, First Officer Paul Hudson, and Engineer Rick De Morgan Jr. all perished on impact with that plane crash. And then, of course, we saw the 3 lives of our volunteer firefighters. The first 2 were Jeff Keaton and Andrew O'Dwyer in southwestern Sydney from the Horsley Park Royal Fire Brigade when a tree fell down through the windscreen of their truck while they were driving down the road. And then a 3rd volunteer, Sam McPaul, who died in another freak accident where an extraordinary weather event generated by the fire that he was working on resulted in localised winds that flipped over the fire tanker that he was working on, and he was killed in the crush of that truck being flipped over. So we saw an unprecedented toll, widespread damage and destruction, and we were operating within a very considered, a very well-practiced policy framework for emergency management and for coordinated firefighting through very clear and articulated arrangements around responsibilities, command and control arrangements, interagency collaboration, whole of government effort through government, out to the Commonwealth, etc., etc. But the scale and the longevity of this season resulted in the activation of policy principles that required decisions and actions to be taken throughout the season, given the scale and the complexity. New South Wales has never experienced the number of interstate and overseas personnel that came to our aid and needed to be seamlessly integrated into operations. We had over 6,500 personnel that joined the firefighting effort from every state and territory of Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the United States, leveraging off existing policy documents that we had developed over years and putting them into action. New South Wales was used to being a big supplier of resources to elsewhere in the country, but we'd never experienced, and overseas, but we'd never experienced the sort of receipt of resources like we did during that last fire season. Similarly, we saw record levels of assistance and support coming from the Commonwealth in terms of assistance, personnel, equipment, and other specialist services through the ADF and through other parts of the Commonwealth. Now, whilst we had unparalleled and unprecedented environmental conditions, operational conditions, we also found that our science and our planning that we were relying on in terms of predictive services and tools to estimate and approximate the burning intensity of fires and the spread of those fires, we were finding that on a number of occasions, the fires were exceeding all expectations around the best available science and specialists that were predicting fire behaviour. We were also seeing fire behaviour at 2, 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, the likes of which you would normally expect to see at 2, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Such were the conditions and the unprecedented nature of the season. I think the Bureau of Meteorology identified that there was one of the latest, if not the latest, onset of monsoonal activity in northern Australia that started to break up the hot, dry air mass in the centre of Australia that was dominating the weather we were experiencing on the east coast. So we had to identify, and then with the impacts going down through the south coast, we were seeing impacts and decisions being taken across government, through government, life-saving decisions that were being implemented that were having fundamental dislocations and disruptions to the livelihoods, to the economic viability, to the lifestyles of people right around New South Wales. And one of the most extraordinary examples in terms of numbers and scale was the decisions to move people out of harm's way down the south coast of New South Wales as we came into Christmas and the New Year, with literally thousands and thousands of people being mobilised to be removed from harm's way. But even in a very dynamic operational environment, we were executing on our arrangements, but we had to be very flexible to adjust and accommodate changes in fire behaviour, impacts that were crossing transport corridors for people to leave, all those sorts of things. Whilst the firefighting effort and our investment in key assets, our investment 18 months before to go to government on a policy change to see investment and purchase our own large air tanker resulted in a level of insurance that really paid dividends this year. So normally we would compete with the Northern Hemisphere for high capacity aircraft, and given the acknowledgement of longer, hotter seasons, overlapping fire seasons between the Northern and Southern Hemispheres, and the uncertainty about securing those assets on a period contract basis, we were fortunate to have the government endorse a policy position, a strategy and an investment, and we're the only jurisdiction in the country that purchased our own large air tanker, and it arrived in late July, early August, and the day it was cleared for operations here in the state, it simply didn't stop for the balance of the season, and then it was bolstered with additional resources that came from overseas in the weeks and months ahead. So the best we could do with the firefighting effort and the coordination of thousands of people, we were averaging between 3,000 to 5,000 people per shift, 24 hours a day in the field, a combination of men and women from right across New South Wales, but as I also indicated, seamlessly integrated with colleagues from around Australia and parts of overseas. Our commitment in policy to ensuring standardised training, standardised systems of operation provided for a relatively seamless integration of that sort of offshore operational expertise tying into the ground effort. And in the sorts of conditions we're experiencing during this fire season, firefighting has its limitations, and as we said very publicly during the fire season, under the worst of conditions that we experienced, we weren't able to put these fires out. The very best we could do was to seek to serve and protect and shore up saving life and saving property as much as we possibly could, given the conditions. So when your firefighting effort is really limited with all that you're throwing at it, the next big lever you can pull in the emergency or the bushfire scenario is our investment in public information and warnings, and our commitment to operational systems that capture information, convert that into intelligence, and allow us to convert that into public information and warnings in a very timely and accurate as possible way was fundamental to saving of lives and communicating awareness about what was happening and how the risk might evolve. A number of amendments to our public information and warning framework were adjusted and modified throughout this season, sharing information that would normally be internally analysed or utilised to determine strategy. We were putting that up as public-facing material and using platforms to share as much as we could so people could make informed decisions, sensible decisions to focus on improving the prospects of saving their lives, their families' lives, and the properties or the homes in which they were occupying. So the firefighting effort, the public information and warnings effort, and then of course we saw policy stretched, challenged, and adjusted when it came to matching a response of assistance, support, recovery, care and healing for the number of people that were devastated and affected by the bushfire event, and remembering that a lot of people that are affected by the bushfire event were also the same people devastated by the drought, so they're then being impacted by the bushfire. A lot of them were also being affected by storms and floods, and now everybody, with the ubiquitous nature of this COVID-19 pandemic, you've got this compounding effect of dislocation, disruption, despair and tragedy, which is right across the people of New South Wales in so many different areas. And the damage and destruction, over 5.5 million hectares burnt out from the Queensland border all the way down to the Victorian border. So with an unprecedented effort in firefighting and communicating, so too came a commitment in funding and support packages that were rolled out around New South Wales and other parts of the country. $3.5 billion worth of support measures and systems and packages were put into effect, with many of them being announced and determined But then as we went through, and I'm talking more about my resilience role now, but as we went through implementing and applying those packages and those support measures, going back to government, going back to the state government, going back to the Commonwealth, and recognising that the policy constructs around those packages or those assistance measures may not always be hitting the mark and may not always be relevant to the gravity of the situation or the nuanced differences in different areas that were required. So being able to capture an evidence base, an example base, and then being able to go back and work with government to adjust policy and amend policy to ensure that its intended applicability was actually relevant and worthwhile and resonating with the intended customer and recipient or benefit that was seeking to be affected on the ground. So everything from, we had over, I think we've got about 11,000 people now that are registered customers through the care system, through Service New South Wales. There's been all manner of different small grants, primary producers grants, individual support packages. We've worked out mechanisms and policies on the way to ensure that we've got partnerships with not-for-profit sector, tying in with legal instruments to ensure investments around temporary or makeshift accommodation while people rebuild and heal on their journey for recovery. We've got programs of support being partnered up with the Commonwealth like we've never seen before, operating under a traditional principal model of assistance, but being nuanced and adjusted and changed to ensure that its applicability is relevant to the unfolding operational circumstances to which we find ourselves. So in this environment, whether it's the legislative constructs or the state instruments around planning and their links with the Commonwealth instruments around planning and execution and policy frameworks for preparing for, responding to and recovering from major events, major disasters, major emergencies like we've experienced in New South Wales, whilst the framework and the architecture was there, there is no doubt that policy evolved and policy was adapted and adjusted along the way, necessarily so, critically so, to ensure that we could deliver the very best firefighting effort possible, but also the very best relevant and necessary suite of support measures and packages that were relevant to the people affected and dislocated by what's been unfolding in New South Wales over the last 6-12 months. I might just pause there, given the time, and most importantly, open up to questions and discussion, which I think will be more relevant for everybody online.
Thanks very much, Shane. It's great to hear your insights, having been through such a significant event and building on your previous experience in fighting bushfire. I am going to ask for questions from the audience, and if you didn't catch earlier, if you click onto the chat with all, because we do have over 200 people participating in this webinar today, we will do our best to facilitate questions to Shane through that chat forum. So, and if you can, I just would ask also, if you're not intending to be on camera, if you could turn your camera off, which is when you hover, you will see a button saying stop my video. If you can effectively kind of mute your camera, that would also be helpful, unless you are wanting to see help us know who you are. Right, so I'll start off on, also if you can let me know when you put your question in which agency you're from. I think that would be good for Shane to know, but I'll just dive in. Shane, how did you balance wanting to keep people informed about the fire season and not flooding them with too much information? I think there's kind of a balance of, you know, how much is enough, and particularly in an emergency context, I think obviously that's a different kind of scenario to the scenario which we are normally faced with within government.
Yeah, absolutely, and is one of the most challenging bodies of work to get that balance right between information overload versus information and relevance to support and assist people making local decisions. What I would say to try and simplify an answer to that is, we've got to take a multifaceted approach as much as we can to getting out information to people and giving people the ability to get on and read further or look further into other details that they might be interested in. What I mean by that is, and I've got some figures actually in front of me, we used everything from the Fires Near Me smartphone application, and during this fire season alone, it was downloaded an additional 2.7 million times by people downloading the app to get information, to get updates, and to monitor what was going on. It wasn't the only tool that was used. The website was quite extraordinary, and it was heavily utilised throughout the season. And I think during the period, the RFS published over 9,000 updates on individual fires, and more generally speaking, on the website during that period. And we kept the information live on the website in a prioritised way. The risk rating of the fires from emergency right through to advice. So the fires were updated with information, and on a graduated way, we seek to upgrade the emergency fires much more frequently than we do the fires that might only be at advice, but are not posing any immediate threat or risk to people. Similarly, getting information from the field that's timely, that's accurate, that's relevant, and getting that through to the state centre and having that factored into state messaging, state press conferences, briefing notes to the Premier, the Minister, all those sorts of things. It is really, really important, but keeping the message consistent, keeping the message as clear and concise as we possibly can, and converting it into candid, plain English language without setting alarm and without driving complacency, but seeking to keep the risk real and keep the risk relevant. So the reality was this season, and particularly as we went into October, 2 people died in October, 7 people died in November, 5 people died in December, and 12 people died in January. The risk was real. The toll was as bad as it gets if we couldn't get messages out and people weren't considering them. In the lead up to the fire season, we also invested very heavily in training and developing media operatives. So all your media outlets, TV, radio, print, chiefs of staff, backroom operators, camera technicians, journalists in the field, all those sorts of people, they get trained in bushfire. They get trained in bushfire awareness, the narrative, the language, how fire behaves, what safety is, what the graduation is of warnings. So we invested in ensuring that others were assisting in getting the message out, explaining the messages, and determining the criticality. One of the things we invested in this season, which we hadn't done previously, was putting up some of the fire prediction maps about the potential for spread of these fires to hopefully wake up and call into sharp focus in people's minds where these fires had the potential to spread. And there is no doubt when we started introducing those sorts of maps on our website, like we've never done before, it really woke people up to crikeys. This fire might be a few kilometres away from me or many kilometres away from me, but the science and the forecast is showing that under the conditions we're expecting tonight or tomorrow, this thing's going to run all the way from the top of the mountain range down to the coast. And I think it was those sorts of tools, those visual depictions, that really reinforce some of the public messaging. So my view always is, tell as much as you can in the time you've got and be ready to follow up, answering questions. And our people were very active, monitoring social media, answering questions online, and pointing them to the reference sources on the web page. And as a matter of fact, the web page becomes a single source of truth. Whether it's call centre operators, whether it's sharing information between agencies, the latest available information will be on the website, and we've got to keep sharing that and emulating that. I don't know if that actually answered the question, but I hope it did.
Sorry, I had my mute on. I think it gave us some fascinating insights into the way that communications are handled during times of operational delivery.
The other thing I would add to that is we used extraordinarily so during this season some of the newer technologies that have come about in recent years, like the emergency alert, where we're delivering deliberate messages to people via their mobile phone through text messaging or through landlines. And we ended up using that over 430 times during this season, which delivered over 2 million text messages and 300,000 voice calls to people's landlines. And it's interesting because everything else we have available to us relies on people having the initiative to look up, to turn on notifications, to watch the news, whereas getting to a phone call, getting to a text message is the only form of intrusive or invasive connectedness we have, apart from door knocking on people's homes. So any manner of techniques we could use, we were using to get the word out and get information out.
I wanted to ask a question. I heard you earlier when you introduced your kind of connection, I guess, with policy, is that policy is only as good as it's fit to the situation on the ground and the ability to apply it. One of the things with policy is that ideally we have an evidence base that helps us understand policy and the options ahead of us, and that we also use that evidence base in its application to inform new policy development. So we have a question about the evidence base that you've been able to use, and could you tell us a bit more about using that evidence base to inform bushfire fighting effort, and also I guess when there is an emergency or an operational delivery of bushfire fighting effort, how you collect more evidence in order to inform future policy development work?
Yeah, and that's a really good question again. So if I go back in my decades in the organisation, I can remember back 30 years where, like a lot of organisations, if you wanted to invest in research or you wanted to invest in science to support your operations, you went shopping for the body that would find the research and find the result that validated what you were doing and why you were doing it. Fortunately, in more recent decades, I've seen us as a society, as an emergency management sector, engaging with science, engaging with researchers, engaging with academics, and engaging with lessons learned and post-event objective independent analyses to actually build the evidence base. Everything from, the characteristics of the landscape and vegetation, fire science, fire behaviour, weather, climate, all those sorts of things. But I think the real thing that's emerged in more recent decades or years is the investment and the regard for social sciences, for the behaviours and attitudes of people, what makes them think, what makes them act a certain way they do, what sort of communiques we deliver, how are they received, how are they resonating, and if I think it's Einstein that said, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, that's the definition of stupidity. So you've got to be garnishing as much information and evidence as you can to adjust your thinking, to adjust your approach, to adjust your policies. And some of the examples I would use as really good examples around the fire science versus the social science. I remember a few years ago, we used to have a very strong public policy facing document that said, if caught out in the open, shelter in your car, blah, 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 you've got a good chance of surviving in the vehicle. Well, we did a lot more research onto more modern vehicles, and the science showed that your prospects of survival were negligible if you were caught in a vehicle and overrun by fire, and they were only marginally better than being out in the open. So we then shifted our whole public information, public education, internal communiques with the fire and emergency services over many years to actually stop saying, sheltering in your car is probably going to be, a safe and viable option in certain circumstances, to reinforcing, don't be in that situation in the first place. But if you do, know that your prospects of survival are remote at best. So there's really material things that build that. The other thing I would say, if we pick up on the social sciences, and it's coming through general research, but for probably the last 15 years at least, or certainly decade at least, after every major fire event in New South Wales, we've actually engaged the National Cooperative Research Centre, whether it was the Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre or the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, which was the latest evolution. We involved them in doing post-impact area research with those affected and those impacted by fires to understand what they thought, how they behaved, why they did that way, what they knew, what they appreciated, what they didn't. And particularly in relation to tools and products like bushfire survival plans, trying to get people to take action, appreciate risk. And some really compelling figures came through those deliberate on-the-ground objective research results. And that was, even in areas where over 90% of people recognised they lived in the highest risk areas, also said they knew they should have done something more. They knew they should have prepared their home. They knew they should have had a plan, but they all found the plan was deemed to be too difficult and too onerous. So completely rewrote the way we deliver that planning instrument. And we've got now, because ultimately everyone wants to get action or behavioural change, well, you're not going to get that if your front-running argument is people think it's too hard. So absolutely evidence and independent evidence and science increasingly underpins policy and approach when it comes to emergency management and fire arrangements.
So you mentioned one thing there that tweaked my interest. I think anyone who works in the policy space wants to know what makes good policy. How are you able to tell if the policy should, continue or be amended, or, how do you kind of evaluate your own kind of policies and know if they're working? Obviously, you get some feedback from stakeholders, but how do you personally work out, what makes good policy? What does good policy mean to you?
So for me, and if I go back to my time with the Rural Fire Service by way of an example, again, looking after a volunteer organisation, the first thing you want is buy-in and relevance. So we work on a philosophy there that any new policy, any new procedure, any new guideline, we would develop with reference groups, consultative groups, cross-section representation across the membership and stakeholder movement. We would then draft those documents up and we would socialise them and seek feedback on a minimum of a 3-month period. Unless, of course, there was an urgent or safety matter that drove, some expeditious requirement for a policy, but socialising and buying in legitimately feedback and inclusion before we landed on the final product was part of the process. And then making sure policy wasn't too prescriptive. I mean, we've all been there. We always try and make policy fit the lowest common denominator, which is a trap. You're always going to have the moron element out there that no matter what we write, no matter what we do, they will seek to pull apart every word in the framework to work out, what's wrong with it or how they get around it or whatever. And trying to write policy for every single example is where I think we struggle the most. So policies which allow for guidance, intent, and remit that still allows for people to exercise judgment, tactics, and behaviours that still align with the policy objective or the policy intent or the policy framework is really important. So feedback, applicability, utilising the policy and being very open to adjusting and amending that as you go, because you can hypothesize, you can speculate, you can forecast and scenario plan as much as you can, and that should underpin your policy framework and architecture. But there is always something that pops up when the event plays out or the circumstances play out that you may not have adequately contemplated or factored into that policy. So reevaluating and ensuring policy review on a periodic basis is really important. And depending on, we've got big policy frameworks, but trying to work on it, depending on the type of policy, some policies or procedures might require an annual review, others might be looking at a 3 to 5 year review, and ensuring that we've got policy owners and ownership that are responsible for and assigned responsibilities for review and renewal of those policies. Sometimes the review might just result in narrative changes because we call things differently now. Sometimes it's like, God, I can't believe we've still got this policy. It's time for a significant rewrite. But having and in the RFS, we factored into directors' responsibilities and accountabilities, policy review on an ongoing basis. So policies had a home, they had an owner, and there was an obligation to ensure that was periodically reviewed.
We have a question about feeding in terms of stakeholders, how RFS, or in your experience, the New South Wales Government has gone in terms of working with community members from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Any suggestion in terms of policy that that may impact those people, or that we need them to take action? I think that has been some of the discussion more recently in terms of the COVID 2019 crisis as well. What is your advice and experience on that?
And it's a good one. And again, it goes back to the policy relevance and your audience relevance environment. So one of the objectives of the Rural Fire Service, for example, is to ensure its local membership, its local brigades, are reflective of the local community. And if we're tailoring products and programs and investments in local communities, we want to be connecting with that local community. And the membership demographic doesn't always reflect what the diversity of that local community. So there are some challenges, but in a Rural Fire Service sense, materials, publications, documents, narratives, trying to connect in with language and depiction, being culturally appreciative and sensitive was really important. Trying to identify champions and supporters in the organisation that could reference and support that, but also, where appropriate, linking in with other government departments. We don't see the same diversity, proportionality in a lot of rural and regional areas like we do in more city or concentrated population areas, which is interesting because that's not where the Rural Fire Service predominantly operates. But I do know, in partnership with, say, Fire and Rescue, which has a strong presence in the built environment, and other emergency service agencies, absolutely there is a greater focus and an investment in trying to connect with and socialise things like safety programs, awareness programs, what to expect if something happens, programs and education. But it's challenging and it's difficult. And like everything, in my view, there would be more that we could do there.
Yeah, I think that that education piece does need to extend across the broader community, particularly people who may travel into areas which they're not normally familiar with, but they're at the same safety risk. I know there's been some work in the drowning space on that.
Absolutely, yeah, yep. It's a good example. Yep.
Yep. What about Aboriginal communities? I think we've got a question about Aboriginal cultural burning and how we can incorporate those concepts in our policies for bush firefighting.
Yeah, so look, it's interesting. It's coming up a lot now since this fire, and it seems to be the latest trend of discussion. But cultural burning, Indigenous practices have been factored into prescription burning and programs for decades. And between the RFS, between national parks and other lead agencies, and working with Aboriginal Affairs and the Land Council, the big challenge is buying in with the right people, the right personalities at those local community levels to get the buy-in. So in the last few years, there's been building resilience in Aboriginal programs or Aboriginal communities, programs that have been developed through the Rural Fire Service. So absolutely, Indigenous communities right across New South Wales, but so too other remote, isolated and unique communities are at the forefront of policy constructs and planning arrangements to capture and onboard knowledge, insights, experiences into practices, but also how can we better engage, prepare, help prevent and mitigate from impacts. And we saw that in quite a number of Indigenous communities up north and even down south during these fire seasons really come to bear, and the investments of years past pay dividends, with a number of those communities having rural fire brigades in them or membership that was akin to that. Don't get me wrong, I can go back in years past and decades past where in some of those local communities it was pretty hostile between fire and emergency services and those local communities, but there was a profound lack of cultural appreciation and recognition and understanding on both sides about what was occurring and why. And where there's investment in that engagement and understanding the what's, the whys, and the hows, you can see dramatic changes and dramatic differences in fire call-outs, emergency call-outs, but then a conduit to partnership programs, because we'll go in there and talk about fire, but then find the real issue is water, but then water is really important for us for fire, so we can then facilitate improved water connectivity. So engagement, investment, relationships are critical to increasing that investment. But again, they're best serviced and best managed, providing we facilitate, engage, support, and assist at the local, because that's where the planning and the operations and the recovery ultimately plays out.
Yeah, and I think that all of those things are important no matter what policy area you're working in. If you've got stakeholders or Aboriginal people that you are working alongside. I wanted to turn a little bit to the future, and particularly your future in Resilience New South Wales, and find out a bit more about policies that you are developing, or the practice of developing policy in both kind of content ways and process ways. Could you tell us more about Resilience New South Wales and what are your priorities for that work going forward? And you might like to kind of include in that addressing climate change.
Yeah, okay. So Resilience New South Wales has been around just over 2 months. It was set up on the 1st of May. So in my last couple of months, it's been a significant listening, learning, absorbing sort of experience. But we are absolutely focused on the remit of being set up as the government's lead agency on disaster preparedness, planning, management and recovery. And we've also got responsibilities for emergency management, policy coordination through the State Emergency Rescue Management Act, the State Emergency Planning instruments and frameworks, and the agencies themselves. We've been doing a body of work. We've engaged some external assistance to help us with that work, and they've had lots of meetings, surveys, discussions with some of the key stakeholders in the Resilience New South Wales operating environment, other government organisations, critically organisations like Regional New South Wales, Customer Service, Infrastructure New South Wales, Premier and Cabinet, etc., etc., etc. So there is a significant body of work occurring as we speak to properly articulate the remit of Resilience New South Wales, making sure we're clear about how we ensure we get reach across government, through government, to ensure that resilience is being factored into planning, built environments, natural environments, social areas, all those sorts of things, considered and coordinated across and through government. So not just across all the government organisations. So we've been deliberately set up as an executive agency in Premier and Cabinet. We've absorbed the former Office of Emergency Management and the Bushfire Recovery Office, and the body of work that's going on at the moment is seeking to ratify and clarify the remit and the functional logic going forward, being mindful not to duplicate or step on what's working really well, but also to look at how we close the gaps or improve cohesion, coordination in an information sharing, policy sharing, and operational and deployment sort of sense across government. In the planning, preparation, prevention and mitigation areas, the response areas, and then also the recovery, rebuilding and healing areas. So we are very new. We've created the agency. We've put together a really simple website at the moment. There's lots more work going on to start building our capability in that public-facing space. And as we've been through this season, there's already a pretty significant amount of work going on in terms of lessons learned, capability frameworks, identifying across 25 broad areas what our state capabilities are, how mature are we in those, what can we do to improve, and taking on board a very open and transparent approach to learning lessons out of this season. We've got some internal reviews being sponsored with some external assistance. We've also got the state inquiry that's ongoing at the moment, that's just due to hand down a report at the end of this month. We've also got the Royal Commission that's afoot, the Federal Royal Commission that's afoot, looking at improvements going forward around interactions and relationships between the Commonwealth and the jurisdictions, and that'll clearly go to some policy areas, and there's some big ones in my view that we could benefit from going forward. So absolutely, there's a very broad range of work going on in a fairly short period of time, whilst we're still trying to keep our focus on recovery, which is compounded and exacerbated by the ongoing operating environment of disasters and disruptions of the last 6 months and the ongoing implications of COVID. So global drivers, global influences, social matters, demographic trends and patterns, industry, economy, all those sorts of things are factoring into what we've got now and the sorts of things we can expect tomorrow. I can envisage things like planning frameworks and templates which will drive policy and consideration at the local level. The best things happen at the local level, whether it's the planning, whether it's the operations and the response, or whether it's the recovery, locally relevant, locally applied, locally owned, but making sure it's enabled, it's facilitated, it's sponsored, and it's supported by the collective effort of government in dealing with and supporting what's necessary at that local level. So yeah, it's a fairly broad area at the moment, lots going on, lots to do, and clearly as a result of that, there'll be considerable policy review and updates that'll be forthcoming over the months ahead.
It's a big task in front of you, and I loved how you gave us the helicopter view from the local to the state level and then back down again, and really because I think as policy practitioners we really need to ground our understanding of what is happening in reality with all the evidence bases that we can obtain. We probably have time for just one more question, and I thought I'd make it a personal question about you as a leader. Sometimes in policy we call people who are kind of leaders and mixing with a lot of a wide circle of people who can be influenced in terms of policy. We call them policy entrepreneurs. I don't know whether that's a term that you associate with, but can you tell us a little bit more about how you operate successfully in achieving good policy outcomes for New South Wales and the people of New South Wales?
So for me, and I think for all leaders, it's really important to listen, understand, and genuinely seek to understand and appreciate what's going on, why it's going on, what's working and why it might not be working, and then seeking to exploit every exposure, every interaction you have with those that can influence and change and prosecute the case. I think the underlying principles of being successful in that space is if you're not obnoxious and you're not a tosser in the process, but if you're genuinely authentic, you're clear about what is needed and why it's needed. You're not exaggerating things. You're not underselling things. You're not being flippant. I think making sure what you're so if I work through some leadership principles, I think the same thing applies in the policy space. Authenticity is absolutely critical. If people genuinely believe in what you're saying and why you're saying it, then that corresponds with trust and confidence. I think making sure you're humble, so you're not being a tosser, you're not being over the top, and your empathy is there about why this policy matters to others, why it matters to the community, why it matters to your teams and your people that you might be relying on. That's really important. Demonstrating that you're taking actions and basing decisions on evidence and what's better for others and not yourself or your organisation really comes through very strongly. I think mutual respect is absolutely fundamental. And as my mother taught us growing up, a great old phrase, manners cost you nothing, but the lack of them can cost you everything. And in a contemporary environment, in the adult world, in the business world, for policymakers and leaders, to me, that distills down to mutual respect. So if you can prosecute very strongly a case, but if you're respectful, if you're well-mannered, you've got a better chance of having that heard, having it considered and having it valued. And I think the final aspect for leadership that underpins all of the above is the word care, C-A-R-E. If we can genuinely demonstrate that we care about the welfare and the interests of people, of our teams, of those in the back room, those on the front line, those above us, those below us, and most importantly, those we're trying to serve, support and protect, then we've got the ability to try and get traction with those we think that can help shift policy arguments. So if we're the whinger or the whiner or we just blow off steam or something, we're not going to have a lot of chance at resonating and getting the buy-in that we want, even if what we're arguing is probably quite valid. It's our approach, it's our consideration, and with politicians, don't get me wrong, during the fire season or during any fire season, I've got the benefit of interacting with prime ministers, with premiers, with ministers, with senior government officials, and using every one of those experiences to calmly and politely and respectfully prosecute the case on why some policies are important and why some policies are a hindrance and what are the options of getting around those. I take every advantage I can.
Thank you. I think that is very good advice for us all, particularly as we, work with other agencies to pursue kind of multilateral or win-win policy objectives. So I think we can continue to work towards that authenticity and bring the passion to the work that we do. We will end here, and I just wanted to end by thanking you. I'm getting a lot of positive messages on the notice board, and I think you've really inspired our members across the New South Wales government. So I wanted to thank you, Shane. I also wanted to thank the team behind the scenes, your team, Maddie, Indy, Steph and Josh for their work in putting this together. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll join us again sometime.
I really look forward to it, and I'll just qualify my last comments by saying one thing. We all must adopt the art of compromise. We may not get what we want first time round when it comes to policy, but getting a foot in the door is really important, and compromising and partnering and working with others, getting somewhere is better than getting nowhere, simply because you're wanting an end result. You've got to start somewhere. So thank you very much, and I really enjoyed joining you this afternoon.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Ta-da.